The origins of the silent war fought in the dense forests of Eastern Europe lie not only in the sweeping geopolitical shifts of the late 1930s, but in the specific doctrines that took shape following the German invasion of the Soviet Union. As the Wehrmacht pushed deeper into Soviet territory in the summer of 1941, a new dimension of warfare began to emerge, one that would be waged not by tanks or bombers, but by small, highly trained reconnaissance units operating far behind enemy lines. Among these, select formations of the Waffen-SS began to develop and deploy scout detachments tasked with covert operations deep in Soviet-held forests. Their purpose was to observe, infiltrate, sabotage, and, if necessary, eliminate opposition before it could strike. This phase of warfare evolved as a result of intersecting military necessities and ideological imperatives. German command recognized early in Operation Barbarossa that the vastness of Soviet territory would demand unconventional means of intelligence gathering. Traditional reconnaissance was insufficient in the endless forests and swamps of Belarus, Ukraine, and the Baltics. Roads were few, visibility was limited, and partisan formations, often Soviet-supported, posed unpredictable threats. The German High Command saw an opportunity to fill this intelligence vacuum with specially trained SS personnel, many drawn from units like the SS Verfügungstruppe and the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler. Their training, already rigorous, was expanded to include survival tactics, stealth movement, and sabotage. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union had long anticipated a regular conflict in its western territories. As early as the 1930s, the Red Army had established deep partisan networks and local defense units in areas likely to fall under occupation. The NKVD, responsible for internal security, maintained files on local populations and had begun organizing cells that could resist a future invasion. By the time German SS scouts began their forest incursions, Soviet doctrine had already laid the groundwork for a counter-infrastructure. Civilians were encouraged or coerced into informing, assisting, or joining partisan activity. Local geography was weaponized. What appeared to the German eye as uninhabited woodland often harbored observation points, hidden camps, or supply caches. The deployment of SS scouts was driven in part by competing jurisdictions within the German war machine. The Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence agency, had long managed frontline reconnaissance. However, tensions between the Wehrmacht and the SS leadership led Heinrich Himmler to authorize the creation of parallel intelligence-gathering structures. Units like the SS Jagdverbände, SS hunting formations, and certain commandos within the Waffen-SS were intended to carry out deep penetration missions, independent of regular army control. These units operated with a combination of autonomy and secrecy, reporting directly to SS command structures such as the Sicherheitsdienst, SD, or Himmler's personal staff. Geopolitically, the forests of Eastern Europe were more than just natural barriers. They were zones of instability where borders had been redrawn multiple times in recent history. Soviet annexations of eastern Poland, the Baltic states, and parts of Romania in 1939-1940 had already destabilized these regions. Resistance simmered among populations who now found themselves under Soviet control for less than 2 years before the Germans arrived. This volatile mix created fertile ground for both collaboration and insurgency. The Germans sought to exploit local anti-Soviet sentiment, recruiting informants or guides for their scout detachments. Conversely, Soviet agents aimed to fan the flames of anti-German resistance. The silent war in the forests also emerged from the broader shift in German strategic thought after the early months of Barbarossa. By the fall of 1941, it was clear that a quick victory was unlikely. As the front lines stagnated and winter approached, the need for accurate intelligence and disruption of Soviet logistics became paramount. Rail lines, ammunition depots, and communication hubs hidden in the woods became primary targets. SS scouts were tasked with locating these assets, directing artillery or airstrikes, and in some cases, infiltrating and destroying them. The Soviet response was equally aggressive, with NKVD troops and Red Army detachments launching sweeping operations to root out infiltrators. Technological asymmetry also shaped this clandestine struggle. German scouts were typically equipped with silenced pistols, explosives, encrypted radios, and lightweight gear designed for mobility and concealment. Soviet partisans, though often less equipped, were resourceful, employing captured weapons, hidden caches, and knowledge of terrain. German reports from the time frequently noted the difficulty in distinguishing armed combatants from civilian woodcutters or hunters. In such a blurred operational environment, reconnaissance became inseparable from counterinsurgency, and survival often hinged on the ability to remain unseen, unheard, and untraceable. Public perception and propaganda added another layer to the conflict. In German newsreels, SS reconnaissance units were portrayed as elite commandos penetrating the enemy heartland. In Soviet broadcasts, partisans were lionized as defenders of the motherland, while infiltrating Germans were dismissed as saboteurs and murderers. These narratives, however, concealed the complexity on the ground, where alliances shifted, loyalties were coerced, and the line between civilian and soldier was often indistinct. By early 1942, both sides recognized that the forests had become not just battlegrounds, but arenas of psychological and strategic significance. For the SS, control of these zones meant advance warning, tactical advantage, and the suppression of Soviet partisan activity. For the Soviets, holding these regions symbolized resilience, adaptability, and national resistance. The next phases of the war would see this hidden conflict escalate, evolve, and ultimately leave deep scars on the populations and landscapes caught in between. As the front lines of Operation Barbarossa advanced rapidly in mid-1941, German high command faced an increasingly pressing dilemma: how to maintain situational awareness and secure logistical pathways across the vast, hostile expanses of the Eastern Front. Soviet infrastructure had been deliberately sabotaged during retreat, bridges destroyed, rail lines mined, and communications severed. The need for real-time intelligence and localized control fell squarely on the shoulders of reconnaissance units. While traditional Wehrmacht scouts played a role, it was the SS's decision to establish specialized forest operatives that marked a critical tactical divergence. These operatives were trained not just to observe, but to shape the environment to German advantage through sabotage, manipulation of local populations, and elimination of threats. The initial deployments of these units, typically consisting of 6 to 12 men, began in areas where German forces encountered persistent resistance or unexplained setbacks, most notably in the Pripyat marshes, the forests near Smolensk, and the southern approaches to Leningrad. These early operations were conducted by members of formations like the SS Sonderbataillon der Lewanger and elements of the SS Totenkopf Division, which, despite their primary combat designations, were detached for reconnaissance and special assignments. Their tasks ranged from charting partisan supply routes to identifying hidden Red Army observation posts. In some cases, they established temporary forest bases equipped with radio links to forward artillery units. Soviet countermeasures were swift and coordinated. The NKVD's internal troops launched immediate sweeps into areas suspected of German infiltration. Villages were interrogated, hunting trails blockaded, and ambushes set up along likely exfiltration routes. Forested regions like Bryansk and Vitebsk became highly contested zones. Soviet doctrine encouraged the formation of fighter detachments, partisan units composed of Red Army remnants, Communist Party officials, and local volunteers. These detachments were often well-armed, supplied by airdrops, and guided by locals familiar with the terrain. The result was a shadow conflict that mirrored the main war but with its own strategies, rhythms, and rules. Reports from SS units describe a landscape as psychologically taxing as it was physically perilous. Scouts moved primarily at night, often sleeping during daylight in concealed dugouts or abandoned farmsteads. Meals were sparse, water sources unreliable, and every noise risked exposure. Missions lasted days or even weeks, with units sometimes operating beyond the reach of support. In areas where the civilian population had turned against the occupiers, informants were scarce and misdirection common. SS patrol logs from autumn 1941 show a significant uptick in casualties due to ambushes, booby traps, and misidentified engagements. Entire teams occasionally vanished without trace. Yet the operational goals of these scouts remained tightly integrated into German battlefield strategy. Prior to major offensives, such as the assaults on Tikhvin or Rostov, SS reconnaissance units were tasked with locating Soviet reserves, measuring the density of partisan cells, and disabling critical infrastructure like rail junctions and supply depots. Their findings often directly shaped artillery bombardments and armored thrusts. A notable instance occurred near Gomel, where scout-derived intelligence enabled the targeted destruction of a Red Army fuel train, delaying Soviet counterattacks for several days. Conversely, failures in intelligence, such as an ambush near Staraya Russa, led to entire German regiments being caught in crossfire or cut off from retreat. The role of technology in this clandestine warfare was significant. German units utilized lightweight radio equipment such as the Torn.Fu WW2 for field transmissions, while the Soviets relied on both human couriers and encrypted wireless sets to maintain contact with partisans. Aerial reconnaissance was hampered by thick forest cover, elevating the importance of on-the-ground human intelligence. The SS increasingly invested in photographic reconnaissance and cartographic updates, often relying on former Soviet maps captured during the initial advances. However, the fast-changing nature of the forest war, new partisan camps, booby-trapped paths, abandoned villages, made many of these tools obsolete within weeks. Civilians were caught in a precarious middle ground. German field policy towards suspected partisan sympathizers vacillated between coercion and collective punishment. In villages where SS scouts suffered casualties, reprisals were swift and often brutal. Soviet propaganda capitalized on these events to reinforce local resistance, while the Germans intensified their efforts to recruit local collaborators, often from Baltic or Ukrainian populations disillusioned with Soviet rule. These collaborators served as interpreters, guides, and sometimes as auxiliary scouts themselves. Yet loyalty was a fleeting currency. Several instances were recorded where such auxiliaries turned on their handlers, leading German patrols into traps or passing information to the Soviets. The moral ambiguity and operational complexity of these early months forged a unique combat dynamic. Unlike conventional battles, this forest war did not produce front lines or territorial gains. Success was measured in information gained, disruptions caused, and threats neutralized. In this environment, the SS scout became a hybrid figure, part soldier, part spy, part executioner, operating in legal and ethical gray zones. The Soviet partisans, in turn, adapted to the new threat with decentralized cells, mobile bases, and strict compartmentalization of information. By late 1941, it was evident that neither side could fully dominate the forested hinterlands. What began as tactical probing evolved into a persistent, silent contest for control over knowledge, movement, and terrain. This contest would only grow more intricate and lethal in the following months, as both German and Soviet command structures began to institutionalize these operations as essential components of their broader war effort. By early 1942, the Forest War had settled into a rhythm of mutual adaptation and escalation. On both sides, field reports and central directives showed a clear evolution in how forest operations were conceived, structured, and executed. Within the SS, reconnaissance activities were increasingly formalized through the development of independent reconnaissance and sabotage detachments, small units specifically selected for their endurance, initiative, and fluency in multiple languages. These detachments were no longer merely extensions of larger divisions, but were given operational autonomy under the oversight of SS intelligence bodies like the Sicherheitsdienst and the Reichssicherheitshauptamt, RSHA. Their role was no longer limited to information gathering. They were expected to shape the battlefield environment before the arrival of regular forces. Strategic objectives for these SS scouts had become more layered. At the tactical level, they were to disrupt Soviet logistics, map partisan movements, and identify potential forward positions. At the operational level, they contributed to larger campaigns by sowing disarray in rear areas, targeting command posts, and even attempting the capture or elimination of key partisan leaders. At the psychological level, their presence was meant to instill fear, encourage compliance among civilians, and project an image of omnipresent surveillance. This was particularly important in contested areas like western Belarus and northern Ukraine, where German control remained tenuous and fluctuated seasonally with Soviet counteroffensive. On the Soviet side, strategic planning around forest resistance was systematized through the central headquarters of the partisan movement, established under the State Defense Committee in May 1942. Under this new structure, partisan warfare became integrated with regular Red Army planning, allowing for greater coordination, supply, and intelligence sharing. Operations were no longer isolated acts of sabotage, but timed to coincide with broader military offensives. Partisan leaders such as Saider Kovpak in Ukraine and Vasily Korj in Belarus began to receive direct orders from Moscow, shifting the resistance from improvised local defense to centrally guided asymmetric warfare. Soviet scouts and reconnaissance operatives, often dressed as civilians or using forged German documents, infiltrated towns and villages to collect data on SS operations, collaborators, and military installations. The logistical aspect of the Forest War demanded increasing resource allocation. German SS reconnaissance teams required supplies that were difficult to transport in bulk. Rations, batteries, medical kits, and ammunition had to be light, concealable, and durable. Camouflaged resupply depots were established in the forests, guarded by auxiliary units or booby-trapped to prevent partisan discovery. The Luftwaffe occasionally conducted aerial resupply drops to isolated scout units operating too far from German lines. Meanwhile, Soviet partisans received support from aircraft based in the rear, delivering food, weapons, and medical personnel. The famed PO-2 biplanes, slow but maneuverable, often flew at treetop level during moonless nights to avoid detection, dropping cargo into clearings marked by arranged fires or signal flags. Both sides refined their propaganda operations in parallel. The Germans printed and distributed leaflets in Russian and Ukrainian warning civilians against aiding partisans and offering rewards for information. Loudspeaker trucks, when available, were driven to forest perimeters to broadcast surrender offers or threats of retaliation. The Soviets responded with their own messaging, smuggling in printed materials from Moscow or broadcasting partisan radio stations like Soviet Belarus that carried interviews, songs, and instructions to resistance fighters. Psychological warfare became central to both strategic planning and field practice, with reconnaissance units often gathering data not just on enemy movement, but on public morale and attitudes. The use of deception and misdirection also intensified. German scouts began staging false flag operations, dressing as partisans to infiltrate resistance groups, or to commit atrocities that would discredit the Soviet movement among locals. Conversely, Soviet operatives disguised themselves in German uniforms, not only for ambushes but to gather intelligence in temporarily occupied villages. Incidents of misidentification increased, and both German and Soviet regular units grew wary of uniformed figures who appeared under ambiguous circumstances. The result was a spike in friendly fire and retaliatory executions, which further destabilized the civilian environment. Command and control structures for SS reconnaissance operations grew more refined. Units were now issued standard operating procedures, including pre-mission briefings, coded reporting formats, and fallback protocols in the event of encirclement. In one example from early 1942, an SS scout team operating near Polotsk was surrounded by Soviet partisans, but managed to hold out for 3 days by utilizing a portable field radio to call in Luftwaffe airstrikes and ground reinforcements. Their survival and subsequent extraction were used in internal reports to argue for increased investment in long-range reconnaissance, including the creation of specialized transport units capable of insertion and extraction from dense forest terrain. The economic dimension of the forest conflict also became more pronounced. The forests were not only hiding places and battlegrounds, but sources of vital resources, firewood, food, and sometimes strategic materials like peat or lumber. Control over these zones meant control over supply chains. German authorities began issuing timber quotas to villages in contested areas and punishing those who failed to meet them, suspecting that missing supplies were being diverted to partisans. Soviet partisans, for their part, relied heavily on the rural peasantry for sustenance, shelter, and labor, creating a strain on local economies that were already ravaged by occupation and war. In some cases, villages were split, some residents aiding SS scouts under duress or for promised rewards, others quietly supporting Soviet fighters out of loyalty or fear. Casualty figures, while difficult to verify precisely, were rising steadily. German records from Army Group Center in mid-1942 note an estimated 800 German or collaborator personnel lost to partisan actions per month across occupied Belarus alone, with a growing proportion attributed to ambushes and sabotage in forested areas. Soviet sources, equally imprecise but indicative, claimed thousands of successful sabotage acts against German logistical routes, often credited to joint operations between partisans and Soviet reconnaissance units. The hidden war was becoming a statistically significant factor in Eastern Front operations, diverting manpower, resources, and attention away from primary military campaigns. By the summer of 1942, both sides had accepted that the war in the forests was not a temporary phenomenon, but a long-term strategic contest. The forest itself had become a theater of war, as critical as any city or battlefield, its thickets concealing both threat and opportunity. For the SS scouts, every rustle in the underbrush could signal a trap or a trail. For the partisans, every broken branch might indicate the presence of an enemy patrol. It was a war without banners or front lines, but one whose outcomes would ripple into the broader conflict as both armies prepared for even larger campaigns ahead. With the intensification of both reconnaissance operations and partisan resistance, the summer and autumn of 1942 witnessed the first major engagements between SS scout teams and organized Soviet partisan units. These confrontations, though often small in scale compared to conventional battles, carried outsized importance due to their tactical consequences and symbolic value. Encounters in regions like Polesia, the Pripyat marshes, and the forests near Vitebsk revealed a pattern. As Soviet partisans became better organized and supplied, their ability to ambush, counter-infiltrate, and even overrun German reconnaissance patrols increased significantly. In response, the SS adjusted its doctrine, shifting from passive reconnaissance to active counterinsurgency missions that often resulted in brutal skirmishes with irregular Soviet forces. One of the earliest and most documented examples occurred in September 1942, when an SS reconnaissance group operating near the village of Komarin encountered a large Soviet partisan detachment. The German team, consisting of 14 men from a specialized SS Aufklärungsabteilung, had been tasked with mapping a partisan supply corridor running north from the Dnieper. Their position was compromised after a Soviet informant recognized one of the German auxiliaries. Within hours, the scouts found themselves encircled and cut off from their extraction route. A firefight ensued that lasted into the following day, with both sides suffering casualties. Though Luftwaffe support was requested, overcast conditions prevented effective air intervention. Only 4 members of the original patrol managed to return to German lines. The incident led to a temporary halt of forest patrols in the region and prompted the re-evaluation of mission parameters. For the Soviet partisans, such encounters were both validation and catalyst. Following Komarin, partisan brigades in the Gomel and Bryansk regions began to set deliberate ambushes specifically targeting reconnaissance units. Forest paths were rigged with mines, hollowed-out trees became sniper hides, and communication wires were replaced with traps. In certain cases, false villages were constructed or occupied with Soviet sympathizers to bait and isolate German patrols. Soviet doctrine emphasized patience and stealth, letting scouts pass before cutting them off from the rear, or isolating them in terrain they believed to be secure. Radio intercepts and defected locals provided the intelligence needed to anticipate German movements with growing accuracy. To counter this, SS units adopted new formations and tactics. Patrols became smaller but more agile, often consisting of 3 to 5 men with overlapping fields of observation. New camouflage uniforms tailored for forest terrain were distributed, and silent weaponry, including the MP-28 submachine gun fitted with suppressors, was increasingly favored. In areas with heavy partisan activity, German command authorized the use of flamethrowers and phosphorus grenades to destroy suspected hideouts and bunker complexes. Though effective in the short term, such measures often alienated the local population, driving more civilians toward partisan allegiance and complicating long-term pacification efforts. Civilian interactions became increasingly fraught. Villages suspected of sheltering scouts or partisans were subjected to strict surveillance and periodic sweeps. German records describe operations such as Aktion Hornis, conducted in November 1942 in the forests near Zlobin, where a joint SS and Wehrmacht detachment detained over 200 villagers for interrogation. Dozens were deported, and several buildings were razed under suspicion of harboring Soviet fighters. Soviet propaganda immediately seized on the event, broadcasting reports of atrocities and using the incident to bolster recruitment among rural populations. Meanwhile, the SS attempted to frame such operations as necessary security stabilization, emphasizing their supposed surgical precision and targeted intent in internal communiques. The psychological dimension of these confrontations intensified. SS scouts, operating under conditions of near constant tension, often experienced high rates of fatigue, disorientation, and stress-related disorders. Reports noted difficulties in maintaining morale among long-range patrol teams, many of whom were in the field for up to 3 weeks at a time without relief. Desertion among auxiliary personnel rose sharply, particularly among local conscripts who feared retribution from Soviet partisans should they be captured or their villages attacked. Soviet fighters, too, bore the toll of this relentless close-quarters conflict. Red Army veterans embedded in partisan units reported difficult maintaining cohesion, discipline, and supply levels in the face of SS counter-reconnaissance sweeps and aerial bombing campaigns. In tactical terms, several forest engagements began to resemble miniaturized campaigns. Between October and December 1942, a protracted series of confrontations unfolded in the Naliboki Forest, northwest of Minsk. Here, a group of Soviet partisans numbering over 600, under the command of Viktor Karasev, established a fortified forest base complete with workshops, medical tents, and ammunition caches. German SS intelligence, after receiving reconnaissance from scouts disguised as locals, planned a three-pronged incursion involving 120 SS troops with armored car support. The resulting battle, though small by frontline standards, lasted 5 days and saw the partisans execute a tactical withdrawal after inflicting significant damage. The Germans seized some materiel and destroyed several bunkers, but were unable to prevent the partisans from regrouping deeper in the woods. Such encounters led to the formulation of joint doctrine between SS scouts and larger anti-partisan units. Scout teams would now proceed clearance operations, marking trails, identifying key terrain, and planting radio beacons for artillery calibration. They also began interrogating captured partisans not just for strategic information, but for insight into patterns of forest movement, signaling systems, and supply logistics. Documents recovered from fallen Soviet operatives revealed hand-drawn maps, coded identifiers for campsites, and detailed rosters of partisan cell members, intelligence that the SS used to preempt future resistance activity. Yet the effectiveness of these efforts remained limited by geography and time. As winter returned, the forest environment became even more challenging. Snow-covered trails and tracks, freezing temperatures, disabled equipment, and visibility dropped. Both sides struggled with frostbite, equipment failure, and poor communication. Nevertheless, operations did not cease. SS units conducted cold weather adaptations, equipping scouts with fur-lined boots, insulated shelters, and emergency flare signals. The Soviets similarly adjusted, relocating camps, digging deeper bunkers, and using sleds for rapid movement. The forests, stripped of foliage but thick with snow, became echo chambers where every sound carried and every patrol risked exposure. Despite the hardships, the resolve on both sides deepened. the forest had become more than just a battleground. It was now a proving ground for doctrines, ideologies, and endurance. Each successful mission, each narrowly avoided ambush, and each intercepted transmission contributed incrementally to a wider understanding of how to conduct this type of warfare. Yet neither side could claim decisive victory in these engagements. Instead, what emerged was a war of attrition, fought in silence, broken only by bursts of violence, and measured not in kilometers gained, but in losses endured and intelligence secured. By the end of 1942, the pattern of clash, adaptation, and reprisal had become the defining rhythm of the SS Scout War behind Soviet lines. It was a rhythm shaped by the forest, dictated by necessity, and sustained by the belief on both sides that control of this hidden theater could tilt the outcome of the broader war. The next phase would bring even greater complexity, as reconnaissance, sabotage, and counterinsurgency blurred ever further into each other, leaving little room for distinction between soldier and spy, mission and reprisal, survival and destruction. As the calendar turned to 1943, the clandestine war in the forests reached a phase of accelerated escalation. No longer confined to isolated patrols and local skirmishes, operations on both sides became larger, more systematic, and increasingly brutal. What began as reconnaissance and sabotage had matured into a full-scale parallel conflict, absorbing more resources and commanding greater attention from both German and Soviet high commands. The SS's forest-based reconnaissance efforts were now deeply entwined with broader counterinsurgency strategies. Scout detachments no longer operated solely as passive observers, but served as advance elements for punitive expeditions, coordinated ambushes, and psychological warfare campaigns. This shift was driven by the growing threat posed by Soviet partisan armies, which had expanded rapidly throughout the rear areas of Army Groups North and Center. By spring 1943, Soviet reports claimed over 16,000 partisans active in German-occupied territories, operating in cohesive brigades with artillery, engineering detachments, and even light armor in rare cases. Though German intelligence viewed these numbers as inflated, they acknowledged the increasing sophistication and frequency of partisan actions. Rail sabotage had reached epidemic levels. German records indicate that in the first 5 months of 1943, over 1,500 partisan-initiated rail disruptions occurred in Belarus alone, delaying troop movements and starving frontline units of ammunition and fuel. SS reconnaissance teams were now tasked not only with locating partisan concentrations, but also with identifying bridges, culverts, and junctions most vulnerable to sabotage. To meet this expanding role, SS scout teams began operating in closer coordination with specialized units such as the Bandenbekämpfungskommandos, anti-bandit commands, and rear area security divisions. These forces often employed brutal tactics, conducting reprisals, mass arrests, and scorched earth operations designed to deprive partisans of civilian support. SS scouts typically preceded these actions, infiltrating deep into forested areas to assess enemy strength and map escape routes. They would then direct follow-up forces toward suspected partisan bases. One such operation occurred in March 1943 during Unternehmen Kugelblitz, Operation Ball Lightning, targeting partisan concentrations in the forests near Bryansk. SS scouts operating in 3-man teams moved in ahead of the main force, setting up observation posts and guiding detachments toward hidden paths and encampments. Though the operation inflicted some losses on Soviet fighters, it also displaced thousands of civilians and left dozens of villages burned, fueling further resistance. The Soviets responded by reinforcing partisan intelligence networks. Radio-equipped reconnaissance cells were embedded in nearly every large partisan brigade, tasked with tracking German movements, mapping rear area installations, and intercepting patrol routes. Soviet aircraft dropped specialized radio operators into forests, many trained in German communications procedures and encryption. These operatives collected and relayed data not only to partisan commanders, but to the Red Army's general staff, tightening the strategic link between forest warfare and conventional operations. In several instances, Soviet reconnaissance teams managed to tap German field lines, gaining insight into patrol schedules and supply drops. The resulting ambushes forced the SS to alter its communication practices, moving toward more compartmentalized planning and encrypted short-range transmission. Technological improvisation also marked this stage of the forest conflict. German SS scouts began carrying small demolition charges for use against bridges and rail lines sabotaged by partisans. In some cases, they used improvised traps of their own, rigged supplies, or booby-trapped huts intended to kill or injure partisans attempting to scavenge abandoned positions. Mines disguised as discarded rations or ammunition boxes became common. Soviet forces developed countermeasures, training operatives in mine detection and initiating discipline protocols for handling captured equipment. The forest, once a natural refuge, was becoming increasingly lethal, not through its own hazards, but through the innovations of those who fought within it. The terrain itself presented evolving challenges. Spring thaw transformed forest paths into impassable swamps, isolating patrols and making supply difficult. Scouts were forced to use elevated walkways or risk days of slow movement through knee-deep mud. In areas near the Berezina and Soj rivers, patrols often relied on collapsible rubber boats to cross flooded lowlands, making them vulnerable to detection and attack. SS reports from May 1943 detail increased incidents of drowning and equipment loss during these crossings. Soviet partisans used the thaw to their advantage, constructing floating supply depots and moving rapidly across submerged areas where mechanized German units could not follow. The physical environment became a weapon in itself, shaping the possibilities of every operation. Command dynamics also evolved. By mid-1943, certain SS divisions had established permanent forest reconnaissance branches within their intelligence structures. Units such as the 4th SS Polizei Division and the 5th SS Wiking Division deployed scouts ahead of major rear area sweeps, issuing them specific quotas. Number of enemy positions identified, maps updated, partisans killed or captured. These metrics were tracked and used to justify further operations. However, these performance-based assessments sometimes led to exaggerated claims and inflated reports, undermining operational accuracy. Soviet partisans, for their part, adopted tighter discipline on reporting, often requiring independent verification of kills, sabotage successes, and intelligence findings. While both sides sought to optimize efficiency, the fog of war in the forest remained thick, and clarity was often an illusion. One particularly complex engagement unfolded in June 1943 in the forests near Klyichev, where a Soviet partisan brigade of roughly 900 men had established a fortified camp with radio links to Moscow. German SS reconnaissance units spent 2 weeks infiltrating the surrounding area, posing as defectors and even planting captured Soviet equipment to sow confusion. When the German assault began, the partisans had already evacuated, alerted by a Soviet reconnaissance patrol that intercepted German radio chatter. The Germans destroyed empty bunkers and caches, but failed to engage the enemy. It was a costly operation in terms of resources and credibility, highlighting the growing parity in forest-based intelligence operations. The human cost of this sustained escalation was evident across the region. German rear area hospitals reported increasing admissions from SS scout teams suffering from wounds, frostbite, exhaustion, and psychological trauma. Soviet partisan units saw rising desertion, particularly among conscripts and local volunteers unprepared for the rigors of sustained forest combat. Civilians caught between these forces faced continued pressure, often subjected to interrogation, forced labor, or deportation by both sides. German authorities attempted to formalize loyalty through village militias, lightly armed groups expected to report on partisan activity and protect supply convoys. Yet these units often lacked discipline, and their allegiance was frequently swayed by survival rather than ideology. The intensification of the Forest War had another effect. It forced high command on both sides to reconsider strategic assumptions. German officers noted that the cumulative disruption caused by partisan and reconnaissance-linked sabotage was beginning to affect entire army groups. Replacement units arrived late or undersupplied. Rail repair teams were overstretched, and valuable combat troops had to be diverted for security duty. Soviet strategists, meanwhile, began integrating forest operations into frontline offensives. During the Battle of Kursk in July 1943, partisan units launched coordinated attacks on German rear lines, guided by scout reports relayed weeks in advance. These strikes hampered reinforcements and repair efforts during one of the Eastern Front's pivotal battles. By the end of summer 1943, it had become clear that the Forest War was no longer peripheral. It was not a sideshow to grand strategy, but an integral part of the war's fabric, one that consumed manpower, redirected resources, and imposed psychological strain on commanders and soldiers alike. For the SS scouts operating behind Soviet lines, each mission now carried not just the threat of ambush, but the weight of strategic consequence. Every piece of intelligence, every encounter with a civilian, every footstep in the forest could ripple outward, altering the trajectory of divisions, delaying offensives, or collapsing a supply chain. In this environment of permanent tension and spiraling complexity, the roles of scout, spy, and saboteur became indistinguishable. The lines between enemy and ally, civilian and combatant, became increasingly blurred. As the tide of war shifted in favor of the Soviets, the SS scouts behind Soviet lines would find themselves not just isolated in geography, but increasingly alone in the war's momentum. The forest that once offered concealment now threatened entrapment as the silent war began to turn against its originators. The latter half of 1943 marked the peak intensity of forest warfare between German SS reconnaissance units and the expanding Soviet partisan movement. With the Red Army's victories at Kursk and Orel altering the momentum of the Eastern Front, the German military was forced into an increasingly reactive stance. Rear areas, once assumed to be stable, became zones of active combat, sabotage, and infiltration. Forests that once provided a buffer between advancing Soviet forces and retreating German columns now became battlegrounds in their own right. SS scout teams, once operating with relative autonomy, were now subordinated to broader rear security doctrines that prioritized disruption suppression over pure reconnaissance. In this phase, the operations reached their most complex and violent form. German High Command authorized a series of coordinated anti-partisan campaigns, combining Wehrmacht security divisions, police battalions, and Waffen-SS reconnaissance detachments into large encircling forces aimed at trapping and liquidating its partisan strongholds. These were no longer probing raids, but full-scale sweeps involving artillery, air support, and scorched earth tactics. The largest of these operations, codenamed Hermann, Adler, and Cottbus, focused on regions such as western Belarus and the southern forests of Smolensk Oblast. SS scouts played a crucial role in all phases of these campaigns, from pre-operation reconnaissance and pathfinding to infiltration and final assault. The July 1943 Operation Hermann, launched in the Naliboki Forest, mobilized over 5,000 German and collaborator troops with the objective of crushing a partisan grouping estimated at 6,000 to 8,000 fighters. SS reconnaissance teams began the operation weeks in advance, mapping forest clearings, identifying partisan trail networks, and deploying disguised observers to monitor civilian movement. However, partisan intelligence gathering proved equally advanced. Soviet reconnaissance teams, often disguised as loggers or villagers, reported German troop buildups and relayed radio intercepts to Central Command. When the German encirclement began, the majority of partisan forces had already relocated. What followed was a destructive campaign in which hundreds of villages were razed, over 4,000 civilians were killed or deported, and minimal partisan casualties were confirmed. For the SS scouts involved, the campaign exposed both the limits of their intelligence reach and the unintended strategic consequences of punitive operations that alienated the population further. While large-scale operations dominated headlines, day-to-day forest warfare remained brutal, erratic, and psychologically draining. Scouts frequently faced ambushes that began and ended within minutes. Soviet partisans, well adapted to the terrain, used silent signals, prearranged kill zones, and coordinated pincer movements to trap German patrols. SS reports from August and September 1943 describe multiple cases of reconnaissance teams being wiped out in engagements that left no survivors to report. In some instances, scouts were captured alive, interrogated, and later executed. In retaliation, SS and police units engaged in village-level reprisals, deepening the cycle of violence and further obscuring the distinction between military targets and civilian bystanders. The presence of Soviet reconnaissance operatives within German-occupied territory became a growing concern. Operating under NKVD or GRU supervision, these agents established hidden observation posts and relay stations that tracked German troop movements and relayed targeting data to Moscow. Some posed as defectors to infiltrate German security services, while others used forged identity papers to pass as locals. The German response was to empower SS scouts with enhanced counterintelligence roles. They began monitoring suspected collaborators, conducting on-the-spot interrogations, and deploying traps designed to identify double agents. The result was an atmosphere of pervasive suspicion, where loyalty was provisional and information was both weapon and liability. At the peak of this conflict, the lines between intelligence gathering and direct combat were blurred beyond recognition. SS reconnaissance patrols were now expected to engage in sabotage, assassination, and psychological operations. In areas where German control was weak, scouts were ordered to make their presence known, leaving signs, issuing threats, or executing symbolic acts meant to sow fear. Soviet partisans responded in kind, posting captured German documents in public places, broadcasting intercepted radio messages, or leaving corpses in visible areas as a warning. The forest became a stage for symbolic gestures as much as strategic maneuvers. New tactical approaches emerged. The SS increasingly employed air mobility to insert reconnaissance teams behind partisan lines, using Fiesler Fi 1 and 56 Storch aircraft, or, in rare cases, captured Soviet planes repainted for deception. These missions aimed to bypass mined trails and partisan patrol zones, dropping scouts into remote forest clearings with supplies for up to 10 days. Soviet forces quickly adapted, identifying likely landing zones and booby-trapping suspected sites. In response, German units began using false radio transmissions to mislead enemy scouts, further complicating the battlefield landscape. Medical support for forest reconnaissance missions remained rudimentary. Injured scouts were often left to either recover in field shelters or attempt to exfiltrate on foot. Few had the luxury of extraction. For Soviet partisans, medical care depended on local villagers or captured supplies. Mobile forest clinics emerged, camouflage dugouts staffed by partisan medics, and visited by rotating doctors flown in from the Soviet rear. German units occasionally discovered these field hospitals and destroyed them, sometimes capturing medical personnel and using them for intelligence. In rare cases, they were executed on the spot, reflecting the total breakdown of conventional wartime norms in this environment. Weather again played a decisive role. The autumn of 1943 brought torrential rains that turned many forest trails into rivers of mud. SS patrols struggled to maintain mobility, with reports indicating that some missions were aborted due to flooded routes and collapsed shelters. Soviet partisans, benefiting from shorter supply lines and more intimate knowledge of the terrain, endured with greater resilience. Their operations continued almost uninterrupted, with renewed emphasis on raiding lightly defended German supply depots and striking isolated checkpoints. In several cases, partisan assaults were guided by reconnaissance data gathered weeks earlier by embedded Soviet agents. The psychological burden on both sides was mounting. SS reports mention cases of hallucination, mutiny, and refusal to deploy among scout teams assigned to particularly hostile sectors. Soviet partisans, many of whom had been fighting since 1941, suffered from chronic exhaustion, malnutrition, and trauma. Commanders on both sides struggled to maintain cohesion, resorting to threats, court-martials, and ideological appeals. German leaflets promised amnesty and food to deserters, while Soviet broadcasts reminded fighters that surrender meant death or deportation. Morale fluctuated with seasons, casualties, and perceived strategic progress, but the will to continue endured, sustained by necessity rather than hope. As 1943 neared its end, it was increasingly evident that the Germans were losing ground, not only at the front lines but in the forests that once concealed their operations. SS reconnaissance patrols reported higher casualty rates and decreasing access to reliable intelligence. Civilians had largely ceased to cooperate, fearing both partisan retribution and German suspicion. Forest bases that once offered relative security were now routinely compromised, either by enemy infiltration or air reconnaissance. Soviet partisans were growing in strength and boldness, moving in larger groups, coordinating across regions, and launching operations timed with Red Army offensives. Their reconnaissance arms, though less technically advanced, had become effective through persistence, decentralization, and popular support. The SS command, though unwilling to publicly acknowledge it, began withdrawing reconnaissance units from the most dangerous forest zones, consolidating resources and prioritizing the defense of critical infrastructure. Scouts were reassigned to urban surveillance, convoy protection, or short-range missions with limited exposure. A silent admission of failure had begun to take shape, a recognition that the deep forest, once an arena for German stealth and superiority, had turned into a trap from which few returned. What had been envisioned as an instrument of dominance had become a theater of erosion, of morale, resources, and tactical initiative. Still, the war behind the lines continued. It had become a necessity, not a choice. The forests remained lethal, unpredictable, and deeply symbolic. Control of them no longer promised victory, but the inability to contest them guaranteed disruption. For the SS scouts, each mission now began with the knowledge that survival was uncertain and success rarely recognized. In the dying light of 1943, they operated not to win, but to delay the inevitable, to slow the advance of a war that had already begun to consume the ground beneath their feet. The arrival of 1944 brought a fundamental shift in the balance of power along the Eastern Front, and with it, a transformation in the function and survival strategy of SS reconnaissance units operating behind Soviet lines. As the Red Army launched its massive counteroffensives, beginning with the winter assaults in Ukraine and culminating in the summer Operation Bagration, the Forest War ceased to be a supplementary theater and instead became a battleground of retreat, desperation, and improvised resistance. German SS scout teams, once tasked with infiltration and observation, were now increasingly employed in rearguard actions, last-ditch sabotage, and the covering of hasty withdrawals. The silent war in the forests evolved into a chaotic contest of adaptation. By early 1944, the Soviet partisan movement had expanded to unprecedented levels. Official Soviet figures, though sometimes inflated, indicated over 25,000 partisans operating across Belarus, Ukraine, and the Baltic states. These formations were no longer isolated or under-equipped. Many were directly integrated with the Red Army's operational plans and armed with heavy machine guns, mortars, anti-tank weapons, and radio communication. Coordination with frontline offensives was standard. Prior to each Soviet push, partisan attacks on German rear areas intensified, targeting fuel depots, bridges, rail junctions, and command posts. SS scouts, deployed in small mobile units, were now more likely to be defending infrastructure or manning emergency outposts than conducting forward reconnaissance. The German response to this mounting pressure was reactive and increasingly fragmented. With fewer resources available and regular army units stretched thin, SS reconnaissance detachments were tasked with holding forested corridors critical to communication and supply. Missions now emphasized disruption over exploration, planting mines, booby-trapping abandoned outposts, or staging diversionary skirmishes to confuse Soviet mapping efforts. Reports from Army Group North in February 1944 describe how SS scout teams were ordered to remain in isolated forest zones for up to 20 days at a time without logistical support, relying entirely on pre-established caches and improvised shelter. Many of these missions ended in disappearance or silence. Others resulted in broken, frostbitten men, returning with minimal intelligence and maximum psychological trauma. Meanwhile, Soviet doctrine embraced adaptability. New partisan tactics included sniper forests, where small teams occupied pre-designated kill zones designed to attrit enemy movement. In the forests near Pinsk, for example, entire patrol routes were abandoned by German units after sustained sniper fire, forcing the Wehrmacht and SS to reroute supply convoys over longer, less secure paths. Soviet scouts and radio teams inserted deeper than ever before, often operating independently of larger partisan brigades. Their role was to report enemy troop shifts, mark airdrop zones for supplies, and deliver coordinates for Red Army artillery or airstrikes. German reconnaissance efforts struggled to match this level of autonomy. The SS units, increasingly reliant on disrupted communication lines and short-range radio, faced a growing intelligence vacuum. Improvisation became a survival mechanism. SS scouts constructed camouflaged forest listening posts near partisan-occupied territories, using buried telephone lines and passive sound equipment to track movement. They recruited local guides where trust could be established, although such arrangements were increasingly rare due to partisan infiltration and the diminishing credibility of German promises. In some areas, particularly in Lithuania and the northern edges of Ukraine, German scouts aligned temporarily with anti-Soviet nationalist formations, sharing intelligence, exchanging weapons, and coordinating defensive actions. These alliances were fragile, shaped more by shared desperation than ideological alignment. The forest itself continued to impose severe limitations. The spring thaw of 1944 submerged many operating areas, rendering footpaths impassable and bogging down mechanical transport. German scout teams reported abandoning radio batteries, heavy weapons, and food supplies to avoid encirclement. Exposure-related casualties rose sharply, with hypothermia and trench foot becoming routine afflictions. Soviet forces, increasingly experienced in forest maneuver warfare, adapted more quickly. Partisan engineers constructed corduroy roads and floating platforms to move men and materiel across marshy expanses, enabling rapid concentration of forces and flexible retreat when required. As the tide turned irreversibly, Soviet partisan operations took on an air of inevitability. Their intelligence feeds became critical to the success of frontline breakthroughs. One notable example occurred during the build-up to Operation Bagration in June 1944. SS scouts operating near the Berezina River identified a suspicious increase in partisan radio activity, but were unable to determine its significance. Within 2 weeks, the Red Army launched a sweeping offensive that shattered Army Group Center. Partisan sabotage crippled railway reinforcement efforts, while forest-based scouts directed Red Army artillery with near real-time accuracy. German SS teams, unprepared for the scale and coordination of the assault, were bypassed, encircled, or overrun. Their reports, if they arrived at all, came too late to influence events. In the wake of such disasters, the role of SS reconnaissance became more desperate. Missions were launched not to win control of forested areas, but to delay the enemy or ensure a path for retreat. Scout teams were often assigned to hold choke points or destroy key bridges after the last German columns had passed. Others were deployed with orders to evacuate vital equipment, bury intelligence materials, or destroy sensitive radio installations before they could fall into Soviet hands. These tasks, though less visible, were vital to protecting the remnants of German cohesion in collapsing sectors. Yet even in retreat, German operations retained a tactical edge in some regions. In the forests north of Vilnius, a group of SS scouts led a counter-ambush that killed over 30 Soviet partisans and recaptured a lost radio codebook. In Latvia, scouts used pre-planted mines and collapsing bridges to delay Soviet pursuit for 3 days, allowing thousands of retreating soldiers to reach defensive positions. These actions, however, were isolated flashes within a larger picture of collapse. For each successful strike, several missions ended in silence, their details reconstructed only through Soviet after-action reports or intercepted transmissions. Civilian involvement continued to evolve. With front lines shifting and Soviet forces advancing, many villagers changed allegiances once more, some out of fear, others from a genuine hope of liberation. SS reconnaissance teams attempting to rely on local intelligence increasingly found themselves misled or betrayed. Partisan retribution against collaborators was swift and often public. German attempts to resuscitate village militia networks failed as supply lines broke and trust evaporated. The forest ceased to be a contested zone and instead became a rear area for Soviet operations. German scouts, once the hunters, now operated as fugitives in hostile territory. By late 1944, the transformation of the Forest War was complete. The SS reconnaissance effort, which had once aimed to dominate the unseen battlefield, now functioned only as a delaying force, a scattered network of men fighting to hold ground that no longer held strategic value. Their missions were shorter, more dangerous, and increasingly one way. Extraction was rare, reinforcement rarer still. Soviet partisan brigades had either merged with advancing Red Army columns or assumed local administrative roles, aiding in the re-establishment of Soviet control and eliminating remnants of German presence. Forests once teeming with uncertainty were now under methodical, structured Soviet authority. Yet the legacy of this conflict did not vanish with the shifting front lines. Minefields remained. Abandoned bunkers and collapsed dugouts dotted the forest floor. Scattered equipment and unburied remains attested to the scale and desperation of the war behind the lines. For the SS reconnaissance units, 1944 represented the culmination of their transformation. From instruments of expansion to agents of retreat, from shadow operators to expendable rear guards. The forest, once a weapon in their hands, had turned against them, harboring an enemy that had grown more numerous, more experienced, and increasingly impossible to contain. And though the official war still raged elsewhere, the outcome in the forests had already been decided. As the final months of the war approached in early 1945, the once feared SS reconnaissance units operating in the forests behind Soviet lines had become a shattered and disjointed remnant. Their original purpose, deep penetration scouting, intelligence gathering, and surgical disruption, was now overtaken by urgent defensive tasks, harassing Soviet columns, covering collapsing flanks, and sabotaging their own infrastructure to slow the enemy's advance. The turning point had long since passed. In the wake of Operation Bagration and the successive Red Army offensives through the Baltic states, Poland, and East Prussia, German forest operations became defined not by strategic ambition, but by improvised survival. The forest, once a domain of stealth and control, was now the last refuge for isolated SS scouts, cut off from command, resupply, or relevance. What remained of the SS reconnaissance structure had been fragmented into localized cells, often operating without coordination or broader operational oversight. Some units retained functioning radios and continued to transmit updates to regional headquarters, though these messages were rarely actionable. Others dissolved entirely, their members blending into retreating regular forces or, in more desperate cases, surrendering to advancing Soviet or Polish units. In Lithuania, for instance, records suggest that one SS scout team abandoned its mission entirely in January 1945 and attempted to cross into neutral Sweden via the Baltic coast, only to be intercepted and executed by Soviet border troops. The Soviet response was not simply tactical, but administrative. As the Red Army pushed westward and occupied previously contested territories, it brought with it not just soldiers, but infrastructure, NKVD units, military tribunals, partisan administrators, and internal security forces, tasked with identifying and eliminating any remaining German operatives. Soviet partisan brigades that had once relied on forest mobility were now often assigned to garrison duty or security patrols, assisting in the mopping up of German holdouts. Forests that once hosted dynamic, clandestine warfare were methodically cleared. Suspected collaborators, sympathizers, or civilians who had previously cooperated with German scouts were arrested, interrogated, and deported. The silence of the forest, once a strategic asset, became a source of paranoia and suspicion. Despite their diminished strength, isolated SS scout detachments continued to execute operations in sectors where retreating Wehrmacht divisions requested reconnaissance or demolition support. In the forests of Pomerania and Silesia, a few scout teams conducted last-minute sabotage missions, targeting fuel dumps, bridges, or communication hubs in areas soon to be abandoned. In some cases, they succeeded in delaying Red Army advances by hours or days, though these delays rarely altered the broader operational picture. Soviet motorized units, supplied with mobile bridging equipment and increasingly reliant on aerial reconnaissance, were less dependent on forest pathways and more capable of bypassing destroyed routes than in previous years. The psychological state of SS reconnaissance personnel had degraded significantly. Reports from surviving officers, as well as post-war Soviet interrogations, describe breakdowns in discipline, morale, and cohesion. Many scouts suffered from exposure, starvation, and combat fatigue. The fear of capture, particularly by partisan units or NKVD detachments, was overwhelming. Stories of summary executions, torture, or long-term internment in labor camps circulated among German ranks, leading some to take their own lives rather than risk surrender. In certain instances, scouts discarded uniforms and identification papers, hoping to pass as civilians. Others attempted to bribe local villagers or pose as displaced persons. Yet even in this environment of collapse, some elements of structured resistance persisted. In East Prussia, for example, a mixed unit of SS scouts and regular army engineers orchestrated a defensive ambush in early February 1945 that temporarily halted a Soviet reconnaissance in force column, buying time for a pocket of encircled German forces to break out. The action, though tactically insignificant in the grander campaign, was reported in German internal bulletins as an example of continued resolve, though it did not mention that the majority of the scout detachment was killed or wounded during the engagement. Civilian suffering escalated alongside military collapse. Forest villages that once formed ambiguous middle grounds between German and Soviet influence became zones of total control, first under retreating German forces that demanded last-minute supplies, then under Soviet forces conducting rapid clearance operations. Villagers who had once provided shelter or information to SS scouts were often punished indiscriminately. The forest lost its ambiguity. It became a space of reprisal, memory, and reckoning. For many civilians, the war's final stages were a brutal confrontation, not only with external occupation, but with the consequences of years of shifting loyalties. Within the remaining ranks of SS reconnaissance personnel, improvisation gave way to resignation. With no realistic prospect of reinforcement, victory, or even extraction, many of the final missions executed in the forests of Central Europe bore the hallmarks of ritualized futility. Demolishing bridges already deemed irrelevant, marking trails through sectors no longer held, transmitting final reports to command structures that no longer responded. The forest had become a vast graveyard of intentions, both tactical and ideological. The Soviets, meanwhile, institutionalized their gains. Former partisan commanders were integrated into regional NKVD or Red Army Command. Forest paths were cleared, bunkers dismantled, and remaining mines disarmed. In several areas, Soviet engineers cut new roads through former guerrilla zones, transforming strategic forests into accessible territory. Where forest bases had once served as lifelines for resistance, they were now turned into storage depots, barracks, or simply left to decay. The war moved on, but the scars in the terrain and the memory remained. For historians and analysts reviewing post-war records, the transformation of SS reconnaissance operations in these final months is notable not for innovation or effect, but for its revealing contrast with the ambitions of earlier years. What had once been sold as elite, precision warfare devolved into reactive, localized acts of delay. The mythos of the SS Scout, ruthless, skilled, and decisive, was undone by the realities of strategic collapse, civilian hostility, and the overwhelming scale of Soviet logistics and coordination. A few scout commanders managed to reach German lines and survive the war, later contributing to debriefings and post-war narratives. Many more vanished into the forest, killed, captured, or simply lost. In the years that followed, the legacy of the Forest War would be shaped by competing ideologies and national memories, glorified in Soviet accounts as a triumph of popular resistance, erased or ignored in German post-war literature, and left ambiguous in the testimonies of civilians who had endured its toll. The forest, once silent, had spoken, Its war had ended, not with victory, but with exhaustion. And though the front lines moved beyond it, the consequences of what happened beneath its canopy would ripple for generations. In unmarked graves, depopulated villages, and the remembered whispers of boots in the undergrowth. For the SS scouts, the turning point had not come with a battle or a directive. It had come with the realization that in the depths of the forest, where no flags flew and no medals were awarded, they were no longer advancing. They were merely delaying the end. With the formal conclusion of combat operations in May 1945, the war in Europe reached its official endpoint. But for many of the SS scouts who had operated behind Soviet lines, the aftermath presented a new and uncertain battlefield. In forested regions stretching from East Prussia to western Ukraine, the legacy of clandestine warfare did not dissolve with the ceasefire. Instead, it bled into a murky period of pursuit, reprisal, and unresolved conflict. Some former SS reconnaissance operatives attempted to exfiltrate westward, aiming to surrender to Allied forces rather than face Soviet capture. Others vanished into the terrain they had once controlled, hoping anonymity would provide protection. A significant number were caught in the tightening net of Soviet security operations that swept through forested areas in the immediate post-war months. The NKVD, now tasked with reasserting full control over all liberated territories, initiated an aggressive campaign to identify, arrest, and prosecute anyone associated with German rear operations, especially those tied to reconnaissance and counterpartisan activity. These units were seen not just as military threats, but as ideological instruments of repression. Soviet military archives indicate that by August 1945, hundreds of former SS operatives had been captured across Poland, Belarus, and the Baltics. Many were found hiding in abandoned forest shelters, camouflaged dugouts, or among civilian refugee flows. Others were betrayed by villagers seeking favor with the new authorities, or caught by chance during routine clearance. The interrogations that followed were often swift and brutal. Soviet investigators sought detailed information about German forest operations, unit structures, names of collaborators, intelligence networks, and locations of hidden equipment or documents. In several cases, captured scouts were forced to guide NKVD search teams through familiar forest routes to uncover caches or unearth mass graves left by the German security forces. These operations were not merely investigative, they were also symbolic. Soviet forces sought to reclaim not just territory, but the narrative of the Forest War itself, reasserting control over the physical and historical terrain. The process of withdrawal and collapse had left a vast quantity of abandoned German materiel scattered throughout the forests. Hidden ammunition depots, buried code books, rusting radio equipment, and tripwire mines were unearthed for months after the formal end of hostilities. Soviet engineers were assigned to demine former operating zones, often relying on local knowledge or reluctant confessions from captured operatives. Civilian casualties continued to occur due to unmarked minefields or traps left by retreating SS units. Entire areas were cordoned off for clearance. In some regions, particularly eastern Poland and western Belarus, civilians were relocated from forest-adjacent villages to reduce risk and to facilitate easier security control. The retreat of SS scout operations left gaps not only in physical presence but in governance. Many forest areas had functioned for years without stable Soviet administration. In their place had grown black market networks, underground partisan remnants, and ambiguous local power structures. Soviet authorities worked quickly to restore a visible state presence, rebuilding police stations, deploying militia, and installing regional Communist Party offices. Yet, the memory of the Forest War lingered. For many civilians, the forest remained a space of trauma, a place where family members had vanished, where allegiances had shifted under pressure, and where violence had often come without warning or explanation. Among the most controversial aspects of the post-war forest campaign was the Soviet treatment of alleged collaborators. In the eyes of the NKVD, the distinction between civilian and combatant was often blurred. Villagers who had provided scouts with food, shelter, or information, even under coercion, were accused of aiding the enemy. Summary executions, deportations to labor camps, and confiscation of property were widespread. In western Ukraine and the Baltic states, this policy collided with ongoing nationalist resistance movements, some of which had once cooperated with German units against Soviet rule. As a result, forests once contested by German scouts and Soviet partisans became new battlegrounds between Soviet internal forces and anti-Soviet insurgents. For the surviving SS reconnaissance personnel who managed to avoid immediate capture, the months following Germany's surrender were dominated by evasion, disguise, and desperation. Some attempted to integrate into displaced persons camps administered by Western allies, using false identities and forged documents. Others crossed borders on foot, posing as refugees or demobilized laborers. A few managed to flee to South America or the Middle East through organized escape networks, though most remained in hiding in Germany or Austria. Allied denazification tribunals occasionally apprehended former scouts, but their specialized role behind Soviet lines often made them invisible in the broader purge of SS personnel. Their files, when found, were often incomplete or vague. Many operated without formal unit insignia or standard documentation. In East Germany and other Soviet satellite states, the narrative of the Forest War was absorbed into broader political propaganda. Partisan heroes were lionized, monuments erected, and school curricula shaped around stories of resistance and sacrifice. The former activities of SS scouts were deliberately erased or reduced to footnotes, presented only as examples of fascist brutality. This simplification overlooked the operational complexity, the fragmented motivations of local collaborators, and the ambiguous loyalties that had shaped the Forest War. In contrast, West German accounts, when they appeared, tended to avoid the subject altogether, focusing instead on battlefield engagements and strategic defeats. The reconnaissance war in the forests was deemed too politically fraught and morally complicated to dissect in public discourse. It was not until decades later that more balanced investigations began to emerge. Researchers accessing declassified Soviet archives, wartime German reports, and local testimonies began to reconstruct the contours of the Forest War, its daily realities, its psychological toll, and its shifting tactical significance. What emerged was a picture of extreme ambiguity, of soldiers who acted as scouts, spies, and executioners, of civilians caught between competing authorities, of a battlefield defined not by flags or fortifications, but by undergrowth, silence, and shadows. The consequences of this war persisted beyond its physical end. In areas most affected by long-term partisan and reconnaissance activity, population displacement was long-lasting. Villages destroyed in 1943 or 1944 were often never rebuilt. Paths used by scouts and partisans alike were later paved over or absorbed into military zones. Oral histories, passed down through families, preserved the memory of forest disappearances, sudden arrests, or quiet acts of resistance. In a few rare cases, memorial plaques were installed at former partisan bases, but rarely, if ever, were the forest dead of the reconnaissance war officially acknowledged. By 1946, the Soviet Union had firmly re-established control over its western territories. The remnants of the SS Forest War had been eliminated, absorbed, or forgotten. Yet the terrain bore its memory. The trees still stood where ambushes once unfolded. The rivers still flowed past ruined bridges, and the land still hid the scars of mines, trenches, and improvised graves. The aftermath of the silent war had not been a treaty or a parade. It had been silence itself, imposed over a landscape that had once echoed with gunfire and whispered commands. It was an end without ceremony, fitting for a war that had never truly had a front. The silent war fought in the forests behind Soviet lines, waged by SS reconnaissance units and countered by a vast network of Soviet partisans and operatives, has long remained a shadowed chapter in the broader history of the Eastern Front. Lacking the sweeping movements of panzer armies or the symbolic clashes of titanic sieges, the Forest War resisted easy narrative packaging. It offered no iconic battles, no decisive fronts, only the slow grind of attrition, the blurred line between soldier and spy, and a relentless fight for control of terrain that was never meant to be seen. Yet, in retrospect, its legacy shaped not only tactical developments during the war, but the post-war understanding of asymmetrical conflict, intelligence warfare, and the limits of occupation. From the outset, the Forest Campaign represented a different kind of warfare. SS Scouts were not traditional combatants. They were selected for their adaptability, their ability to navigate hostile terrain, and their psychological resilience. Operating in isolated, high-risk environments, they were expected to fulfill multiple roles: infiltrator, interrogator, saboteur, and assassin. Their opponents, partisans trained and supplied by the Soviet state, mirrored them in form if not in function. Both sides utilized camouflage, deception, and local networks. Both understood the terrain better than most generals. Both worked in silence. The SS leadership envisioned their scout units as elite instruments of preemptive control. When conventional armies could not reach into the forests, scouts would operate as eyes and daggers in the dark, mapping roads, marking targets, and disrupting enemy preparations. In practice, the mission expanded rapidly. As Soviet partisan strength grew, scouts were pressed into service as pathfinders for anti-partisan columns, guides for punitive expeditions, and collectors of intelligence meant to stabilize regions slipping from German control. Their autonomy was curtailed by necessity, their operations shaped more by the Soviet counter-movement than by centralized German planning. Soviet partisan command, for its part, recognized the forest not just as sanctuary, but as strategic depth. With every mile the Red Army lost in the first months of Barbarossa, the forest grew in importance, as a place to regroup, to strike, to wait. By embedding partisan warfare into overall strategic planning, the Soviets transformed an emergency measure into a coordinated weapon. Their reconnaissance elements, increasingly professionalized, began to mirror German methods: long-range insertion, radio coordination, psychological operations, and rapid localized strikes. The forest became not a place of escape, but of influence, a testing ground for the asymmetric doctrine that would echo through Soviet military thought well into the Cold War. The tactical legacy of this confrontation was substantial. German forces were forced to reevaluate the vulnerability of rear areas in modern mechanized warfare. The assumption that rapid advances and administrative control could stabilize vast conquered regions proved deeply flawed. Even the presence of SS units, trained and equipped to deal with irregular threats, did not prevent the deterioration of security in key sectors. By the time Soviet offensives gained momentum, the reconnaissance war had become reactive, driven less by initiative and more by crisis response. It drained manpower, consumed resources, and compelled strategic decisions that indirectly weakened German capacity at the front. On the Soviet side, the effectiveness of coordinated partisan operations, many of them enabled by their own reconnaissance teams, validated an investment in local resistance and irregular command structures. This fed directly into post-war doctrine, shaping how the Soviet Union viewed potential rear threats, occupation scenarios, and the cultivation of loyalist networks abroad. Lessons learned in the forests of Belarus and Ukraine were not forgotten in the Soviet interventions in Hungary, Czechoslovakia, or Afghanistan. Forest warfare offered a model of layered, decentralized resistance that could survive even in the face of overwhelming enemy control. Yet the human legacy of the forest war is less easily quantified. For civilians living in or near contested woodlands, the war was not defined by ideology or victory, but by survival. German SS scouts and Soviet partisans alike depended on local knowledge, food, and shelter. Villagers became bargaining chips, informants, or scapegoats. Every house near a patrol route risked a visit, every path a mine. The forest ceased to be neutral. It demanded a choice, often under threat, and punished hesitation. The repercussions lasted beyond the war. Families divided by suspicion, reputations destroyed by rumor, and entire communities erased by reprisals or forgotten by post-war reconstruction. For the men who served in SS reconnaissance units, the Forest War offered little in the way of recognition. Their missions were classified, their successes rarely celebrated, and their failures often terminal. Unlike Panzer crews or Luftwaffe pilots, they did not accumulate medals or features in propaganda reels. Their legacy, such as it was, existed mostly in after-action reports and intelligence dossiers, many of which were destroyed, seized, or buried by time. In post-war narratives, their role was obscured by the broader collapse of the German war effort and the ideological burden attached to the SS name. In the Soviet Union, partisan heroes were elevated to iconic status. Streets were named after them, memoirs published, monuments erected. But even here, the war in the forest was simplified, rendered into stories of heroic resistance, sanitized of internal disputes, civilian coercion, or the moral compromises demanded by irregular war. The Forest War, like many asymmetrical conflicts, resisted black and white interpretation. It left behind not only the memory of bravery, but the reality of ambiguity, fear, and irreversible loss. Decades later, the forests themselves still bear witness. Archaeological surveys uncover remnants of bunkers, field kitchens, and munitions caches. Human remains, long hidden beneath moss and soil, continue to be unearthed, some with identification, many without. In areas where the ground froze and thawed through years of peace, fragments of the war remain embedded. Shell casings, uniform buttons, rusted knives, scraps of radio wire. These silent artifacts speak not of grand battles, but of persistence, improvisation, and quiet death. Historians have gradually begun to reconstruct this war, drawing from both German and Soviet sources, survivor testimony, and on-the-ground investigation. The story that emerges is not one of clean timelines or decisive moments, but of overlapping operations, contradictory orders, and the long echo of decisions made far from the trees where they played out. It is a war of margins, geographic, political, and moral. In this way, the legacy of the SS scouts behind Soviet lines transcends their immediate failure. Their campaign illustrated the limits of authoritarian control in hostile terrain, the importance of local legitimacy in contested spaces, and the endurance of decentralized resistance in the face of overwhelming force. These lessons, however hard-earned and obscured by ideology, remain relevant in every modern conflict, where militaries face not just enemy armies, but invisible networks, terrain-driven resistance, and wars without clear fronts. The Forest War ended without surrender ceremonies or treaties. Its final chapter was not written on a battlefield, but in the empty paths left untrodden, the last radio signals sent without response, and the burial mounds unmarked by rank or cause. The silence that followed was not peace, it was aftermath. And in that silence, the war behind the lines continues to demand remembrance. Not to glorify, but to understand. Not to forget, but to acknowledge. In the forests where neither side fully won, the only enduring truth is that even the quietest wars leave the deepest roots.